This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, we're good to go. All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation and this esteemed intercontinental audience. So I know that some of you are very optimistic and maybe others are pessimistic about where we're going to get to sustainability, but we're going to have, I'll be providing quite a bit of information again, where we've been and where we're going and what we've learned so far with this landmark groundwater law. Just a quick show of hands, who has a working knowledge of SGMA? A lot of you. All right, so I thought. Who has never heard of SGMA? Okay, good. All right, so I might skip some of the stuff, some of the 101 stuff, but first, I want to introduce myself. So my name is Stephen Springhorn. As Karndev mentioned, I work in our Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. I started at DWR in 2005 as a student, and I started in a regional office doing a lot of field work, technical work, and then I joined the predecessor to the SGMA office right as the law passed in 2014. So it's been a wild ride in the groundwater world, and I think, but it's been exciting because there's been a lot of fun work along the way. Okay, so let's get going. And I was going to share a lot of gory details, but since someone's online from Mar-a-Lago, I got to keep it on straight and narrow, I guess. Some government organization might be listening. Okay, so I decided to sort of organize the agenda tonight with the different eras of groundwater, California's groundwater. So this is going to even predate SGMA. And so we're going to talk about different parts of that. And when you might, as a geologist, and again, thank you for inviting a geologist to the engineering chapter, appreciate that. But you might think of the geologic eras, or if you're a parent of two daughters, you might think of Taylor Swift, of her Eras tour. I don't know if anyone else has been hearing a lot about that, but it's pretty wild these days. Yeah, but the groundwater eras that we're going to talk about are really from the early days of groundwater extraction and utilization, really using the resource as much as possible. And then the management as part of that is really sort of state enabled. So there were some general abilities to use groundwater, put it to use, and there was that sort of utilization, almost mining mentality in the early days back, at the turn of the century, all the way even to the 80s, which we know has caused some of the problems we still see today. Then the next era that we'll talk about is more of, there was a little bit of groundwater management. It was incentive based. So it was the carrot approach. And that was in the early the 90s to early 2000s. And then the majority of the time that we'll talk about tonight is really where we are now. That started with the paradigm shift in groundwater management. That was SGMA and all of the activity that has taken place since, which has been a lot. And it really is now the main shift in that, which has driven a lot of this action, is it's required. So there is no more getting out of groundwater management, and there's no more plan to plan. It's plan and implement that plan. And we'll talk more about that. But in the context of SGMA and general water management, as you all know, we're dealing with really interesting variability and extremes. And so in that context, we'll sort of talk about how that's impacting groundwater tonight. And so that's what we face now and know we'll face in the future. And then the final era is, we're in a new era of aquifer characterization and replenishment, which is really exciting. There was a lot of fundamental work that happened decades ago by the department. They were very, very much in that process, identifying, doing principal work in some of these groundwater basins to define them. And so we're going to get back into that realm with some of the efforts I'll talk about tonight and that our team's working on. Okay, so we know that California swings from one extreme to the next, whether it's too dry, too wet, and that's happened cyclically over the years. But today I want to try and highlight that really groundwater is a mechanism. The groundwater basins in the state, or our natural infrastructure, are a way to sort of smooth out that extreme. Whether in too dry, groundwater basins act as our buffer. When it's too wet, we use that water to replenish our groundwater for the next drought we know is coming. But in many cases, for a long time, groundwater is really out of sight, out of mind. And so because of that, that's led to, depletion. But I'm going to try and make the case, and many of you are already working on this right now, and a lot of us will in our careers, is that in some cases, groundwater basins are still underutilized. We're not using the maximum potential of the state's vast groundwater resources or network and infrastructure. And so there's a lot of effort to really understand our groundwater basins better than ever before, and then utilize them in the way of replenishment, more replenishment, a little less pumping at the end of the day, to get to sustainability by not tomorrow, but 2040. Okay, so sort of the landscape along the way. So if you look at the landscape of floods and droughts in California, and then you look at, this was a study in Nature by J. Miglietti, now at Arizona, looking at change in storage in the Central Valley, all the way back to the 60s. And that red line is part of the USGS CVHM model. The blue line is the new GRACE work, the satellites that they're using, gravity satellites. And so you see a declining trend, and each drought, successive drought, is a deeper and deeper hole or deficit we've created collectively in the state of California. So you start to see that there was some recovery in the late 70s into the 80s, big declines in the late 80s, early 90s drought. And then we've been just successively going deeper and deeper. It's sort of like a tennis ball bouncing downstairs. And that's really what the groundwater basins have really been suffering and feeling. And we see the symptoms of this cause are subsidence, a foot a year of subsidence in the heart of the drought that we've seen, and hundreds of square miles, which causes impacts to infrastructure, 5,700 dry wells since 2016. So there's some big impacts, and that really led to big changes in the groundwater world. So now on those changes and those different eras of groundwater management, there's a little gray star there, which is an interesting tidbit, that in 1978, right after one of the most severe droughts at that time in California, then Governor Brown, in his first tour of duty, tried to pass a very similar bill that looked very similar to SGMA. It did not go through, but as you can imagine, because that was pretty controversial at the time, but if you could imagine, if we had SGMA from 1978 till now, we'd be in a much different position. But just sort of shows you, and you'll see these dots sort of align to a common theme as we add more of them. And it sort of is never let a crisis go unused. And so then the next big drought hits. So no action on groundwater, even though surface water is being regulated for 100 years, no action on groundwater, more and more depletion. The first part of the carrot approach to groundwater management came in 1992. This was voluntary groundwater management plans, AB 3030. Then it went a long time to 2002, actually not in a drought, but this was the part 2 of voluntary groundwater management planning. This was AB 1938. And this actually had a little bit more framework around groundwater management, which ultimately led to some foundational work. And some of those districts, like the Orange County water districts of the world, and mostly in Southern California, where they've been adjudicated or been using groundwater since the 30s, they took this and ran with it. So some of these districts took these 2 voluntary options and they went full steam ahead, defined special act districts, and did lots of characterization and did a lot of great proactive management, but it was a fraction of all the basins in the state. So then another drought hits. This was the 2007-2009 drought. This is where we got what is called our CASGEM program, California Statewide Groundwater Elevation Program. So this was just tiptoeing in to say every basin in the state has to at least monitor groundwater levels. So that was thought of as a revolutionary concept, but it's just groundwater levels. And some people actually said, well, this is just going to be the first step in a multi-step process to regulate groundwater. And they were sort of right. But it took a while. But then the severe drought of 2012 to 2016, 15, 16 hit. And that's where all of these compounding effects of overdraft, excessive depletion, subsidence, dry wells, drying streams, it all was compounding to get the political will enough to SGMA passed. And I remember watching the votes when I was over in our regional office, not realizing the impact of it, but realizing that this was going to be a complete career, like just career-making type of bill that's passing, because this is a once-in-a-generational type of bill that comes in for geologists, engineers, everyone that's working on it. And it has created an entire ecosystem of work in the state level and consultant world. And there's still, we still need a ton of talent to keep it going because we're running short. Okay, so then we fast forward, we get into our next big floods and droughts. And then actually just recently, a recharge-related bill was passed, SB 659, which requires DWR to put in the California Water Plan a recharge action plan and a lot more metrics and a central clearinghouse of how much is being recharged. So that's a great effort. And really, this graph shows that there's a lot of room to store excess flows that when we get them, because we need to flatten that curve is the goal of SGMA, if you can sum it up. Okay, so quickly going through water storage and infrastructure. You all know California's natural and built surface water infrastructure. On the groundwater side, we have similar natural and built groundwater infrastructure. It's sort of, you have to think of it a little differently, where we have our built groundwater infrastructure is the roughly 300,000+ groundwater production wells that we have in the state that pump water out of the ground, and a lot more water than that goes back in. I just mentioned that new bill is going to help with this, but we have no idea, which is a little scary, but we're working on it, of how many recharge basins, ASR wells, the true groundwater infrastructure that actually gets water back into the ground. But then we also have our 515 groundwater basins that are our natural infrastructure that are ready to be utilized and replenished in many cases. So just a sort of a spin on built and natural infrastructure. And groundwater basins really represent the best future potential for storage because we don't really have any more big rivers to dam. You can increase the size of dams a little bit, but the cost ratio of doing groundwater storage versus surface storage is order of magnitude difference. And a lot of people have realized that and are working on that. Okay, so then the 3 buckets of water in California, just again to not hit you over the head of how important groundwater is, but it is. So snowpack any given year, 15 million acre feet. Reservoirs any given year, or the total reservoirs of the 1,200+ reservoirs in California, about 30 million acre feet. And this number is very uncertain, but back in the 70s through Bulletin 118 and the department's groundwater bulletin, they estimated about 850 million acre feet to 1.3 billion acre feet of total storage in our groundwater basins across the state. Now, not all of that's usable, obviously, in a sustainable way, but we do have a ton of storage in our groundwater basins. And so a year like we just had, we were in a bad situation on surface and groundwater side in the drought. A year like we just had definitely got rid of the surface water drought, but we are still in our long-term groundwater drought, if you want to call it that, and groundwater deficit. So we had great recovery on the surface water side, but we still are running that about 100 million acre feet deficit in the Central Valley. And we have the change in groundwater storage just in the last 3 water years is minus 17 million acre feet. Now that we get that information from the SGMA annual reports, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So we still have a lot of work to do. So anytime you hear we're out of the drought, just think of the groundwater, because we're still very much deficit and drought and will be for some time. It's going to take a lot of wet years and a lot of hard work, continued work on SGMA implementation. And that's a huge question mark on that. What is really our true usable groundwater storage, which we're working on and plan to publish in the next Bulletin 118. All right, so now shifting to the era of sustainable groundwater management. So we know we have various uses and beneficial users and uses of groundwater in California, from agriculture that uses anywhere from 80 to 90% of California's groundwater, drinking water, where many towns and cities are 100% reliant on groundwater, and 52% of all the domestic wells in the entire state are outside of groundwater basins in fractured rock areas. We have environmental uses of groundwater and groundwater-dependent ecosystems and interconnected surface water, and then industry. So we have a multifaceted set of uses and also priorities, conflicting priorities in some cases, on groundwater. So we're going to go through a timeline. We're shifting the timeline a little bit vertically, like a well into the ground. So again, we started SGMA it was born out of the severe drought of that time. Just fun fact, not one legislator in the Central Valley voted for SGMA, but there was enough votes across the whole state to make it pass. And some people that did vote for it got voted out the next session or election. So it was very controversial to get it in. So it was with that context that SGMA came to be, and Governor Brown in his third term got to actually sign a bill that really got us on the track to sustainability, which it really took a lot of political capital. And I think he might have been the only one that could really do it, because he was able to utilize his capital and he didn't really care at that point. He's like, we just need to get stuff done that matters and we're going to do it. And he did it, which was really exciting. So we started the law with all these different, you can't read them, all these different activities. The orange are DWR actions, the green are local actions, and different colors. And we started with 3 employees. I was employee number 2 in what was before SGMA. We had some regional office staff, but it was a mountain of information or work to try and tackle. And so we'll talk about sort of where we went through it. So we have 515 groundwater basins, 94 high and medium priority basins where SGMA is required, and then the critically overdrafted basins, which represent over 60% of the entire groundwater pumped in all of the entire state, comes from those 21 basins. So that's just a quick SGMA landscape. I think all of you know that SGMA is founded on local control, local flexibility, because if it was state down, one size fits all, it would have never passed. And there's just a lot of uniqueness in the different groundwater basins across the state. But DWR is in a central role in providing technical assistance and also a regulatory role now, which was new for us, but we're getting sort of used to that now. Then the state board was the state board sort of enforcing agency, which they're flexing their powers right now in real time for the first time. So we're seeing how all that's working. And then the GSAs are at the steering wheel and steering their basins through all of this. And then the key performance metrics of all of it are these 6 undesirable results. Think of these as the big warning lights in the basin. If these start to pop off, bad things are going to happen and they're getting off the rails, whether it's declining groundwater levels, subsidence. These are the key performance metrics that the locals have set for themselves, considering the local interest in their basin. And these are the ones that we're keeping them honest to at the state. So these are the important ones. Okay, so what's in a groundwater sustainability plan? I think everyone's pretty much aware of this. I'll sort of skip this, but it's important because these plans are the document that has to put down what is sustainability. They have to define what sustainability is, how it's going to be achieved, how they're going to implement it, and it has to be realistic and factual and all of this, and it has to be implemented, which was a very new concept before SGMA was here. So about 2017, Yeah, so we wrote 2 sets of regulations to say what had to be in a GSP and how it all worked. And then the GSAs were formed, 250 plus brand new local agencies. Think of these as any other local agency, but a brand new local agency had to be formed, 250 of them. The record goes to the East San Joaquin groundwater basin. I think it has 26 GSAs in it. And that's part of the local flexibility. Some of these had 15 GSAs, some of them one. So they could have any number of GSAs, which, as you can imagine, that many entities trying to make this hard decisions like they have to make, it's very complicated on the governance side. So I think some of them are sort of kicking themselves that they went the multiple GSA route. But then some of them right now that are in state board intervention are actually further disaggregating because they're all sort of going to their corners now that they're in with the regulator, the state backstop, if you want to call it that, to sort of just see how they can make it through the process. Okay, and then all of the plans, groundwater sustainability plans came in and being reviewed. So there's 94 basins, as I mentioned, that had to comply and submit a plan. In that, 122 plans came in. Each one of these plans is at least 1,000 plus pages. Some of them, I think Kern holds a record of like 15,000 pages of information with all the appendices and all that. And like GSAs, GSPs, there was an option. You could have as many GSPs as you wanted. So some of them had 7 GSPs for one basin, but they had to get stitched together by what was called a coordination agreement. Some of those were one piece of paper that said, we're going to coordinate. And they all signed it. Some of them are very, very in-depth and very thought out. So it was the Wild West in the early days because the basins that were critically overdrafted were first up. So in the worst condition, but first up in having to develop their plan and submit it to the department in January of 2020, which was not a lot of time for this amount of work to happen and to form a local government, an agency. So those entities in red on this map, I shared that some took those early groundwater management, voluntary management options and ran with them. Those red basins were approved alternatives. They got the fast track. They didn't even have to do a GSP because they submitted something to us saying, we're already sustainable, or we have a plan that already is like a GSP. We reviewed that. Some of them didn't make that cut. 9 of them did. And then that first wave of plans for the critically overdrafted basins were 46 plans for 21 basins. And then there were, in the second tranche, the non-critically overdrafted basins, there were 67 plans for 63 basins. So you could see that as SGMA was progressing, people were understanding less plans was more efficient. And so the big bulk, thank goodness, was a single plan for each basin, which was really, really good for the review part too. Okay, so where are we in SGMA on the regulatory side? So our teams have been cranking through these thousands of pages, hundreds of meetings with the locals, and we came out with, we had to make some very tough decisions on what made the line, what was approved, what wasn't approved, what all or many went out with what was called incomplete, meaning that there wasn't enough for us to approve it. They had 6 months to give us information back. Then we looked at that again, and then if they fixed the issues, then they were approved. If they didn't, and 6 didn't, they're at the state board now through state board intervention. So we have 14 approved, 6 inadequate at the state board, 1 still incomplete. That's Madera, because they had sort of an interesting timeline that they are on. But yeah, it is fully, SGMA is fully playing out right now with its full scope initiated, which is really interesting. And then of the high and medium priority basins, we had 63 basins, 65, sorry, GSPs. 40 have been approved. 6 just October 26th got deemed incomplete. Those magenta basins there on the west side of the Sacramento Valley. And then we have 17 pending. So out of those 122 plans, the DWR team has cranked through all of them and will deliver every single one assessment by January 31st of 2024, which is our statutory deadline. So we were required, within 2 years of receiving the plan, we had to review it and provide an assessment. So we were held accountable too at DWR, because we couldn't just spend 5 years reviewing something. We have had to deliver, and it's been a monumental task to hit that, even that we got 2 years. So then ongoing, every one of these plans have to be at least every 5 years, they have to do a periodic update. And then every one of these plans, plus all of the 30 plus adjudicated areas, now have to submit an annual report, which is every April 1st for the previous water year. So if you haven't looked at these annual reports, they're a gold mine of information on actual groundwater use, total water use, change in storage. This is stuff that we've always had to back into in California groundwater. It's the closure term, but now it's actual information. And some of it's coming from models, not many is coming from meters, but it's a tremendous wealth of information for any basin you might be working in. So I'd recommend taking a look at that. All right, some themes of the plan review. All of them needed work. As mentioned, short timelines. They just didn't have a lot of time to really put it all together in a very organized way. And so they just put it down and sent it in. And so even approved plans have a lot of work to do, and they're going to need to adaptively manage over time. But then some of the incomplete plans, they were disorganized, but they had big gaps. So in these things above the line here in the pyramid is on interconnected surface water. That was a very hard one. That's still very challenging, complex topic. That's an emerging field in SGMA. Groundwater levels and drinking water impacts. This was a big one. Some plans came in and said it's going to be a glide path or business as usual. We're just going to, groundwater levels are going to keep going down, and that's going to dewater 40% of the domestic wells, and that's just how it's going to go. So some of those got called. We called them and said, no, that's not okay. Come back and reset your sustainability criteria to not have that big of an impact. Water quality was a big one, and then subsidence was a big one as well. So those were some of the key themes that which pushed some of them over into that incomplete or inadequate realm, and they're working on those right now. Okay, so fast forward to the end of that, what used to be thought a daunting, it has been daunting timeline. We're at the end of it with all those boxes checked. The state board is in that process of intervention right now, which is going to take some time, and there's going to be quite a bit of back and forth. And then when they're out of that, they come back to us and local implementation. The locals do. So I think overall it was a huge success. And at the end of the day, right now, actually we're a little bit bigger, but we have, I think, 60 plus in SGMA with another 40 plus in the regional offices. So the state has had to really ramp up in order to handle all this regulatory technical assistance, all this work. So we're continuing to expand in SGMA. So if you're interested, we're hiring. We need good people like you in SGMA to keep hammering this stuff forward. And so this is one thing we've said within our team, that even though all this work has happened, that we're not at the end. We're just beginning SGMA. So all of this, almost 10 years in, we're at the end of the beginning. So all of this hard work in formation of GSAs, development of GSPs, our review of those, we're still at the beginning, because the hard work really is implementing those plans to get to sustainability by 2040 or 42. So yeah, we're just at the end of the beginning. And as I mentioned, annual reports are coming through. That's how we track progress year in and year out between the periodic updates. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on water year 2023, and that was sort of a special year, and we did some pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so I already talked about this. Okay, so some of the challenges we've seen Even though it's not completely new, it's new-ish. Governance and management structures, these are still evolving, even almost 10 years in. The local and regional coordination, balancing competing interests, and making sure that these GSAs have stable funding is super important. Because if they don't have stable funding and they're reliant on state grants, once those grants dry up, like they are starting to dry up now because we're in a budget deficit, they're not going to have the tools necessary to actually govern or implement their plan. So that's a big deal, is sustainable funding. Some of the water quantity challenges we've seen is, again, balancing that water budget that I showed at the start of the talk. We're in a huge hole in the groundwater realm in California, and balancing supply and demand those are very, very hard decisions that these elected boards have to make, and they're doing this right. They're doing it right now, and it has not been a very pleasant hydrology for them to be implementing SGMA in these first almost 10 years, because we've had some really severe droughts. Land subsidence, we see the different water years of land subsidence, and this is another great data set that we are put out, and also someone in the room helps get this data onto these maps, so thank you. Yeah, there's been a great team effort on all this. And then also allocations and markets are big. So in order to deal with the shortage in any one basin, they're developing allocations and markets to then move what water they can pump around to the high value crops, or doing marketing or allocations to live within their new sustainable yield. And then, as we know, it's all going to be interesting as we continue to have our variability and changing climate. I'll just quickly go through quality changes, because I know this is getting a little long. That water quality, SGMA is not there to fix water quality. It's meant to come in and be dovetailed into existing water quality initiatives that are already out there and regulated by the board. But the important part is that SGMA or GSP actions do not exacerbate water quality issues. So if they're going and doing a bunch of recharge on dairy land or something like that, and that's pushing nitrates down to impacting wells or whatever, that stuff, that's within the SGMA realm. But cleaning up a plume that was already there, that's really not SGMA realm. But there's some interesting water quality challenges as they go to implement these plans in the various basins. And some of the new flood water diversion and recharge is an emerging area that we're trying to get more information about. What does it really do? Is it benefit or negative, or a challenge with putting flood water on the ground? Is it causing problems, or are the benefits outweighing the risks? Okay, so shifting gears. How much time do I have, Arndev? Okay, great. All right, so now shifting gears. So that was sort of the past, the present, where we are, and then now we're in this new era of aquifer characterization, which is really neat. We're getting back into that realm at DWR. We're going to be doing original work with a big team, as you can see. This is sort of like our NASCAR slide. We're working with Woodard and Curran, Ramble, SkyTem who flies the helicopter with the airborne electromagnetic hoop there, and a whole host of other consultants that are going to be along with us, along with our bigger DWR team, like the watershed team within our division of planning, and others in the department. So it's really exciting times. We're just getting started. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit and point you to some available data and tools if you're interested, and then a real quick touch on how we're trying to utilize some of this new information to maximize flood diversion and recharge with this last winter. So I know this is a lot. Sorry, I'll just so really what you probably can't see any of this, but we're not doing this in some disconnected way. Basin characterization is going to be around for a while. We have baseline funding now. We are fortunate to have this be a every year thing in perpetuity, which is fantastic and sort of a unicorn type moment in state budgeting. but we have 3 swim lanes. So the first is California's Groundwater Bulletin 118. This is the state's comprehensive document on all things groundwater, conditions, monitoring, management, and we're required to publish it every 5 years. So this will be where all of what we learn and produce gets put up into Bulletin 118, which then gets connected to the California Water Plan and Bulletin 160, which are intentionally offset by a couple of years, so one can feed the other. But that middle swim lane is our basin characterization effort. The lights have been off on that for a long time, for decades, but we're with this helicopter study I'll show you a little bit more about. We've really got a lot of momentum, and we're going to be building on that momentum to be compiling all this subsurface information, doing local pilots, regional studies, connecting with the watershed studies that DWR is doing, FloodMar, and our modeling team, C2B Sim, to be bringing that into a 2- and 3-dimensional texture database. So we can have a foundational repository of the best available subsurface information, so it can feed into any downstream model, study, you name it, and have that so we can recrank the wheel every few years so we have the best available information and we can steward that over time. And then on the bottom swim lane it's on the bottom for a reason, because it supports, is foundational in our data collection and stewardship. So this is our group stewards the statewide well completion report database, OSCAR. We had to sort of stretch to call it that with that acronym. CASGEM, all this new geophysical data we have, subsidence, water quality, land use, and the list goes on. And we're going to be increasing the amount of groundwater data that's coming in with some of this new funding, where we're going to be deploying a lot more real-time groundwater telemetry setups, so we can actually have some more operational groundwater data. And then all of that gets fed through as few of web applications as possible, so people can actually get it and there isn't web app fatigue. So the highest level, Cal Groundwater Live, is a layperson look at what's the current updated daily status of California's groundwater. Sigma Data Viewer is sort of the Home Depot type of app where you have to sort of know where to look, but it has everything. And then we're building some new 2- and 3-dimensional data viewers, which I'll share on the next couple slides. And the foundation of all of it is open data. So once it's there, it's available for us and everyone else. That's a big sort of principle for us, is sharing the information to open data so that anyone else can use it. Okay, so these are the 3 pillars of our basin characterization work. Continue data collection. So we're flying helicopters, we're using satellite data, we're drilling holes in the ground. All this information will continue, and it's going to be compiled and analyzed to create these texture and hydrostratigraphic models that I mentioned. We're going to start with the Central Valley first. So we're going to sort of go big from the beginning. We'll see how that goes. And then the 3rd pillar is data archive. As mentioned, all of what we learn and document will get fed into Bulletin 118. But we're doing this in an informed way. So what we put into it, we're trying to get out of it for a specific reason. So recharge is a big one, as we know. So we're trying to inform our studies on advancing recharge suitability, looking at fast paths to the subsurface, as they're called, identifying principal or primary aquifers, aquitards, subsidence potential. So basically this matches up with that list of undesirable results and the issues that some of the GSAs still have. We're trying to align these data offerings and tools to help locals and us collectively work through it. And so we're going to do this through a community of practice. So if you're interested in participating in this basin characterization work that we're just starting, the beginning of next calendar year, we're going to be kicking off a basin characterization work group. It's open to anyone. And so it's going to be a forum for us to share information similar to sort of the FloodMar network, but focused on basin characterization. So happy to have anyone participate that's interested. Okay, so this is a movie that hopefully works. So we have 15,000 line miles of AEM data now. We're about 98% complete of the statewide survey. That took about 2-ish years. And so now these are some of our beta 2D and 3D viewers, where now this is resistivity data that we're looking at. And now you can slice through all of this data and fly through it. You can start to see paleo channels coming up. You can see where there's, you can see the Tulare Lake there. There's a big clay plug where the Tulare Lake and Corcoran clay have been for thousands of years. So we can see the subsurface like we've never been able to see it before. And so, but we still have a lot of gaps in between these transects, these AEM transects. So we're going to try and fill that with compiling all of this AEM data with all of our million well completion reports, or ones that we can digitize, and other subsurface information, so we can fill those gaps. So that, again, this can be the foundation for updating model grids, aquifer parameters, you name it. So yeah, this is just sort of going through different functionality. You can get the transects themselves, and all of this is publicly available right now. So if you're interested, I can point you to where that is. Okay, so yeah, that marks a huge improvement in our subsurface data. We also have this on our Sigma data viewer, where you can have a depth slice horizontally, and you can overlay GSA boundaries, rivers, SAGB, you name it. You can overlay all this stuff, and you can sort of see where these, and in this case, it's texture data. So this is where we've gone from resistivity, inverted it to texture, percent coarse. So you can see the reds here are near 80 to 90% to 100% coarse. So these are our preferential pathways to the deeper subsurface. So you can see the incised valley fills, or where the rivers used to come out into the Central Valley that got filled up with coarse grain material. So these are our super highways into the subsurface for water, for actual molecules, but also pressure. And so you can see along the Sacramento River and all of that down there in the Kern Basin, where there's a lot of groundwater banking that happens. So again, we're trying to put this out and get people to use it and add their data to it. I'll skip this for now. Again, all of this AEM data is on open data, so you can download it and all the reports that go with it, and then the viewers that I shared are on there as well. And then we're going to be launching a basin characterization webpage that talks about where we're headed on that. That should be up in the next couple of weeks. But our landing page for Bulletin 118 has some information now. Okay, so I know this is sort of rapid fire, but I just want to touch quickly, if we do have time, on how we use some of this AEM data or understanding, and then try to, through another emergency, advance our ability to put some of this water we got last year into the ground, working with locals to enhance their efforts. So this connects to the California Water Resilience Portfolio and the governor's water supply strategy. So even before this last runoff season, this wet winter, the governor was already putting down a marker saying this shall be done by date X, as opposed to, again, holding us accountable at the state, just like we're holding the locals accountable. So in this water supply strategy, the governor said the board and DWR shall expedite recharge in these different ways. And I'm going to talk about two of them. One deals with FloodMar and Sigma. There's other efforts to streamline water right permits with DWR and the board working together. And then some of the flood, water, and recharge executive orders. So even on top of this, the governor then came down in about March with a series of executive orders that said, because he talked to our director and said, you're capturing some of this water, right? Is what she said to us. And she's like, yep, but we need some streamlining for it to really be at scale. And so the governor put down executive orders to really streamline what was possible. And I think a number of years worth of incremental process was sort of skipped with these executive orders, and then what turned into a Senate bill that was codified in July. So I think we just did a quantum leap in some regards in the flood diversion and recharge space because of this last winter and high level interest. And knowing that we're only going to get so many of these big years in the SGMA timeline, that we have to maximize our use within reason, as we know, so that we can use that recharged water to then withstand the droughts, dry times. So this just, we're in the process of trying to understand and compile all of these moving pieces. So it's distributed across the entire state, across all these basins. There's so much happening, so it's very hard. And again, there's no centralized repository yet. But the executive orders that the governor put down for flood diversion and recharge, there was a requirement to submit some quantification to the state board. And between March and September, almost 400,000 acre feet of water was diverted on about 100,000 acres of land. And so this is translating into some pretty big numbers. And again, this was just, it went into place in March, and people were on it because in SGMA, they know it's either you reduce demand or you increase supply. Those are the two knobs you have to balance your budget, water budget. And so there's recharge is top of mind for almost all of the groundwater sustainability agencies. And the board, to their credit, they were doing a bunch of streamlining of permits and allowing for the potential recharge or flood diversion to happen. And then the state's been putting out over $100 million in the last 2 years to the GSAs to enhance the state's recharge infrastructure. So, and these are all projects and actions that are nested within their groundwater sustainability plans. So in the SGMA plans, as I mentioned, the two knobs, supply and demand. No surprise that GSAs want to get they want their path to sustainability to be recharge based, because it means, 1 acre foot you can recharge is 1 less acre foot you have to turn the pumps off, right? Which is very impactful. So there's a lot riding on being able to recharge, which I think, as we're seeing, that's not possible. There's going to have to be those cuts in demand and recharge together to really get to a sustainable yield. But FloodMar is a really great example of this. Has been all the way back, I think, since 2017. The department has been working on this, and so we've been trying to plug this into various GSA efforts. The FloodMar team has been doing that as well, and this year has been a great year in advancing the department's FloodMar initiative. I think we're just continuing to hit the gas pedal on that as we connect more of the SGMA stuff to it. So we know we had the atmospheric rivers that led to flooding. We're using some new techniques to try and get inundated area from satellites. So again, another thing our GIS team at DWR is helping us with is trying to match up what we know of in the GSPs of recharge basins, so what we see from the satellite, and see where we have a match of recharge basins full of water from what the satellite sees, or areas that they're recharging that we don't know about. So we're just going to be some sort of true up of trying to get a better handle on our recharge infrastructure. And you can't see it, but there's thousands of little dots. And those are thousands of little recharge basins that people are putting water on 5 acres here, 10 acres here. Some are huge, but a lot of them are small. But all of that makes a difference because on the right-hand side, as I mentioned, there's a huge deficit in groundwater storage. So I'm going to skip this to this. Basically what we did is the Tulare Lake was filling up. There was a huge multi-state agency response to the Tulare, it's called the Tulare Basin Advanced Planning Unit. And so everything was being done to try and figure out how can we minimize water going to the lake bed. So there was an idea where we proposed, after talking, using our SGMA connections, talking with a lot of these districts, the GSAs, the flood districts, who some of them are the same people. They're saying, well, we're using temporary pumps like in this picture here to take the flood water off and put it on. This is Floodmar in action right here. This is Don Cameron, who's called sort of the godfather of Floodmar. This is his Terra Nova Ranch. And that's a 50 CFS pump and a 5 or 10 CFS pump there. And they were doing this already, but there was also some limitations. And so we came in to supplement and help provide 30 pumps across these areas in green, so they could really surge up and take as much floodwater as they could. And then we're also, a longer term effort is where GSAs have already bought land, but there's still orchards on them or vines, and that recharge rates are not that great. So we're paying to have the land cleared, deep ripped, and some temporary berms push up, so we have additional acreage for floodwater to go as sort of a layoff area and then recharge. So we're going to be doing a lot more of this. We're working with our colleagues at the board and also Fish and Wildlife. So we're going to be working through this. And again, this is more of a pilot. This is new ground, and so there's a lot to learn on this concept, but there's a lot of interest. So I think with that, I'll close with, as you can see, there's a fire hose of groundwater data being put out there now. I encourage you to take a look at it, use it. If you see there's something that you need but we haven't developed yet, let us know, because we do have resources to be making sure we're providing data that's needed in the SGMA space and groundwater space. I think as this cheesy graphic shows, everything's connected. And so really, I think the more that we can communicate with each other and then with external entities, local entities, underserved communities, the more these pilots and efforts are going to start to take hold. So I'll just leave it with that. And I think Camiar, our division manager of Division of Planning, he always says the hardest stuff is the soft stuff. And that's talking with people, outreach. All of that takes so much time, but we would have never done this temporary pump and rip and chip stuff or land clearing if we wouldn't have talked with people on the ground of what they need. And so there's a lot of that I think we can all collectively go forth and do. Thanks for the attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Turn off the recording, but
okay.
We can continue on with the questions.